Welcome to this fourth lecture looking at the late antique cosmological transition. In the last lecture, we looked at how the medieval worldview developed and changed over time. And in this lecture, we're going to be drilling down into that turning point between the ancient and medieval worldviews. And the case that I'll be making is that the medieval cosmological worldview associated with Christianity and with the Bible more generally, associated with all forms of Christianity that we see today, that worldview was a medieval construct developed in response to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It was not a continuation of an ancient worldview. And it was not a continuation of the Second Temple period Jewish worldview in particular, the one within which the Old and New Testaments were compiled and put together. Now, instead, what we see at the end of antiquity, at the end of the ancient period, is a cosmological revolution. And a new cosmology was formed. Just as we saw with the transition from the medieval to the modern, the same thing happened when it comes to worldview. The same thing happened cosmologically with the transition from the ancient to the medieval. It was the transition from a biblical apocalyptic cosmos of heavenly powers, cosmic rebellion, sacred geography, and angelic mediation to a more philosophical, hierarchical, metaphysical cosmos. There's lots of big words in there, and I wouldn't expect that it would make complete sense right now. By the end of this lecture, I hope that it will. And certainly by the end of this course, that should become crystal clear to you. In broad terms, the worldview of the ancient period was one which was personally governed by divine beings, and one in which the cosmos above had certain ways of relating to the earth below. In the medieval world, though, that was very different. It was a different supernatural worldview. And so let's get started on looking at this. We're going to have four headings largely for your notes, if you are taking notes for this lecture. First, we're going to look at the Second Temple period cosmos generally. We're then going to look at the reasons why the Second Temple period cosmos, that Jewish worldview that within which the Bible texts were created, that the reasons that became problematic during the transition away from the Roman world. We're then going to look at the role of Neoplatonism, which was a very important Greek philosophical school in terms of having an input into the development of the medieval worldview. And then at the end, we're going to finish by just looking at, what was lost and what was gained during this transition. We're not here to judge it, just to understand it. So let's get started. Now, the Second Temple period cosmos, let me first briefly explain these terms. They might not be familiar with everybody. In my lectures generally, I'm going to be using the terms First Temple and First Temple period, and Second Temple and Second Temple period. These are the terms used by scholars to demarcate, to define the various stages of Israelite and Jewish history. So I would contend that the period of the First Temple was the period of the Israelites, and then in the Second Temple period, we're dealing with the Jews. There was continuation between those two groups, but there was also significant change in between the two, with the Babylonian exile as the juncture point in between the two of them. Now, so what I'm going to be outlining for you here is the collapse of the Second Temple period Jewish cosmos. And so that's when I say Second Temple period, I'm using a term which is used in largely Jewish history to talk about the period from, let's say, the 6th century BC up till 70 AD. Now, this was an inherited cosmological tradition that Second Temple period Jews lived in. We can largely see that throughout the ancient period, all the way stretching back into prehistory, there was pretty much continuity in the various forms of the cosmos and how people saw it. If you move through ancient history, you won't see the types of revolutionary changes in worldview that we can detect with the transition into the medieval period, for example, that we're talking about. And the Second Temple period worldview shared several key features with the cosmological system that was broadly shared across Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East, that's the region around Palestine, the Greco-Roman world later, and even across into India, and I would argue even across into China and other parts of the world. It was a cosmological system that was globally very similar and had a shared set of attributes. Those attributes included a populated heaven. When ancient people looked at the night sky, when they looked at the stars, and indeed when they looked at the sun during the day, they saw beings. They didn't look out on a material cosmos the way a modern person does. They looked out on a populated sky. And the beings that they saw, not just represented there, the beings that they saw there really quite concretely. They didn't see them as just representations. They really saw the gods. We would call them the gods. In the Second Temple period Jewish worldview, they were sometimes called the gods. You can find that in Psalm 82. But they also were called Elohim, which just means a being, an intelligent being that doesn't have a body. That's what that word Elohim means in the Hebrew originally. And so when ancient people looked out at the sky, they saw a populated heaven. And by and large, what they believed they were looking at is what scholars call the divine council system. There's a scholar in recent decades in Christian circles, Dr. Michael Heiser, who has done fantastic work excavating the divine council worldview in the Bible and in the Dead Sea Scroll text to show that in the Second Temple period Jewish worldview, they did not see God alone in the sky. That was a later development, a development associated more with sects like the Pharisees. By and large, the traditional view, and particularly the view of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Essenian Judaism, which we're going to talk about later in the course, the view that they took was that God delegated governance of creation to the small g gods. We can call them the Elohim. You might even prefer to call them the angels. Not a very helpful term, but sure, you could call them that. Whatever you want to call them, that heaven was governed not by God sitting in the sky alone in an empty cosmos, but instead it was a divine council system where God was in relationship with the beings that in turn governed the human realm. There was also a significant motif, a significant symbol that stretches all the way through the ancient worldview, and it was we call it the cosmic mountain motif. If you've ever heard of Mount Olympus in the Greek religion, then that's their example of the cosmic mountain. In Korean ancient cosmology, it was Baekdusan, which is a Baekdu mountain in what is today northern Korea. All, I'm going to go so far as to say pretty much all ancient cultures had a motif of a cosmic mountain, and as we're going to see, it's within that symbolic frame of reference that we should understand Eden. More on that later. There was also in the Second Temple period Jewish worldview a motif of celestial rebellion and conflict. Divine powers were territorial, so gods ruled nations. That's you can see that in Deuteronomy 32. You can see that in the biblical texts, and it came through in the various festivals and rituals also that we can see with ancient Israel and with the Jews later. Also, time was divinely governed and divinely ordered. And if you want to learn more about the divine governance of time, I would encourage you, if you enjoy these lectures, to consider buying a copy of my book, The Great Year of Man, where I outline a theory of how the ancient Bible writers saw the divine governance of time. And also there was, and we see this in reference in Genesis 6, there was a belief in the literality, the actual existence of giants and divine human hybrids, monsters, those sorts of things. And when you look at the translations of the Old Testament that we have sometimes, it's unfortunate that many of the terms that might be translated as, for example, hyena in the Old Testament, when you look at the original Hebrew, probably meant something more closer to, or something like a werewolf. But we can get into that in another course, and you can find content online by people who are exploring those ideas these days. And so this Second Temple period cosmological worldview, it's evident in Daniel, Genesis, and Ezekiel. It's evident in 1 Enoch and Jubilees, and indeed across the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's particularly evident in Revelation, which is we will come to be looking at later in this course, because John draws heavily upon this cosmological worldview that some scholars associate with the First Temple period in particular, and Essenian Judaism. And it's also evident in early Christian apocalyptic literature. This worldview dies out in the literature as antiquity comes to an end, and by the early Middle Ages, it's really been replaced by what we looked at with the medieval cosmological worldview. Now, not for a second should we think that this was a primitive and unsophisticated cosmology. The ancient cosmological worldview, the more that you come to terms with it and come to understand it on its own terms, the more that you see that it draws upon a shared cosmological order stretching back to prehistoric times, and it's my contention, my view, that it's a cosmology which would have provided a very stabilizing sense of meaning to the people who shared it. But maybe we'll talk about that in the next lecture. But it collapsed. It did fall apart. And so why? What were the reasons why this Second Temple period Jewish worldview, and indeed actually more broadly, why did this ancient cosmological worldview, because the Greeks and Romans had their own form of this ancient cosmological worldview. I already mentioned Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus and the Council of Zeus plays much the same role in ancient Greek cosmology that Eden and the Divine Council played for Second Temple period Jews. And so why is it across the board that we see the collapse? Well, there was a convergence of several historical pressures, and I'm going to be focusing on the European transition, particularly really the Western European transition. Over in the Byzantine Empire, things were a little different, but I'm really focused here on the Western European medieval worldview, the transition into that. And there are a couple of pressures that came to bear. The first one was that as the church came to appropriate cultural, philosophical, and religious power to itself, it became evident to the church fathers, the later church fathers, if you like, that they had an enormous problem of heresy. There were groups like the Gnostics, the Manichaeans, the Arians, all sorts of different heretical sects as far as the church authorities were concerned. That's just what they believed. That those sects were essentially dividing the flock and creating problems by bringing in teachings that weren't canonical as far as the church fathers were concerned. This was a large driver into the development of the idea of canonicity, the idea that only certain texts should be studied and understood. And for those church authorities dealing with these issues of heresy, the supernaturalism of the Second Temple period texts in particular was particularly problematic. They saw that in the Enochian literature and in the various supernatural beliefs which accompanied that literature, that it was a source of error and heresy as far as they were concerned, and so it was more convenient. It made the transition to the Christian culture that they sought to achieve more possible to just shut it all down. And they did a fantastic job because the suppression of the texts was very thorough. Only the Ethiopian church kept the Enochian literature, for example. And if it wasn't for the rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we probably wouldn't know a lot of this stuff, which is very interesting. That second pressure I've already mentioned, it was this issue of canonicity. What's canon and what's not? That was something that was a huge controversy in the first centuries of the church, and it became critical during the rise of Christianity. And so, although the Enochic literature, when I say Enochic, I mean the Book of Enoch, pretty much, okay? Although that Enochic or Enochian literature was considered sacred scripture by some Second Temple period Jews, it was, not all of them, but some of them, particularly in the Qumran community and among the Essenes, considered the Book of Enoch. what they would have called sacred scripture, although they didn't talk about canonicity the same way. And even some early church fathers early on indicated that they saw the Book of Enoch as canon. Off the top of my head, I haven't recorded who it was changed his mind. It may have been Origen, but you should check that fact. But there was one early church father who seems to have had a change of mind over the course of his life. But there was a view that it was sacred scripture, but it became unpopular among church fathers over time. And it was really St. Augustine who sealed the deal on just shutting down that whole Enochian literature and really putting to bed this ancient cosmological worldview and replacing it with a Neoplatonic worldview, which we'll get to in a second. Another issue that led to the suppression of the ancient cosmological worldview, with all of its Genesis 6 references to giants and all of that supernatural sort of messiness. Another issue was that there was a question about human agency, and there were church authorities who expressed that Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch took moral agency away from humans by saying that rebellious angels came down and mated with women to create the Nephilim. If you're not familiar, we'll talk about this later in the course. This is what that Enochian literature points to. And it became increasingly unacceptable to church theology when so much of church theology came to be about original sin and the agency of humans in terms of salvation. There was also philosophical pressure that came from Christianity being adopted by societies thoroughly soaked in Greek philosophy. The Greek metaphysical worldview that the Christian concepts were grafted onto was itself already changing and being influenced heavily by philosophy. And the Greek worldview of late antiquity required that the cosmos be an intelligible, abstract order. One of the great contributions of Plato to cosmology was the formulation of an idea which was already strong among Greek philosophers, that the chaotic personal cosmos of the East, the Mesopotamians and the ancient Near Easterners, was insufficient. The Greeks wanted their cosmos to be philosophically rational and ordered, not personal. And so it couldn't be the diffuse system ruled by a personal creator in relationship to governing angels and men. That's a bit too chaotic and it's not philosophical enough. So the pressure of the Neoplatonic desire to bring rational, ordered systematization onto cosmology also led to the collapse of that ancient worldview, which was more narrative-led, more mythic, more supernatural. And finally, and I do think this might be controversial for some, but I think it's important to acknowledge, there was all of this from the church authorities, really, I would argue, was driven by a desire for control. The church authorities were seeking to centralize control over the worldview of diverse peoples across a collapsing Roman Empire. And so to do that, I believe they seized the chalice and implemented this more metaphysically ordered, philosophical, human-created, reason-created, if you like, worldview that of the medieval worldview that we looked at, in order to better control these disparate cultures that they were now spiritually in charge of. And all of this, as I mentioned, was occurring in the context of Neoplatonic philosophy becoming more and more popular and dominant within the Greek world. Although it was a Roman Empire, it was a Greek culture. The Greeks, if you wanted to be an intellectual, if you wanted to be educated, you were going to be speaking Greek. And so the Greek metaphysical worldview onto which the Christian concepts were grafted was Neoplatonic. And this was largely put together by St. Augustine, who sought to moralize the cosmos as a basis for a post-Roman social order. In his City of God, he sought to take the order which had been civic under the Roman political authorities, and transcend it to heaven so that it's still governed despite what was happening down here on earth. This metaphysical worldview was based on Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. Neoplatonism supplied the framework and had to do with the unity of being and a hierarchy of creation. I've talked a little bit about that. I probably don't need to go into so much detail about that. It's not central to what we're looking at. And the work of Aristotle, ironically, became more prominent during the High Middle Ages as the confidence in reason that we discussed earlier increased. And so Aristotle provides a remarkable example of a man whose work featured prominently in an intellectual revolution that happened some 1,500 years after his death during the High Middle Ages, when Aristotelian natural philosophy came to be taken on more and more, and the Platonic idealistic philosophy tended to fall out of favor. All of this came together with the great chain of being that I've talked about earlier, and it was a moral and political hierarchy that wasn't rooted in prehistoric revelation. It was rooted in a philosophical framework that ultimately went back to Greek philosophy. And I think it's significant, and I believe Christians or modern people not really understanding this has prevented us perhaps from having a better understanding of what the Bible means. All right, I won't go on too much about that. We'll be talking about that for the rest of the subject. So let's look at what was lost and what was gained. So just again, we're talking about the transition from the ancient cosmological worldview to the medieval, a worldview based upon personal beings governing with lots of mythic features and symbolic motifs, changing into this more philosophical, ordered, rational, reasoned worldview of the medieval period. So what was lost was personal cosmic governance, like you see in the Enochic and Dead Sea Scrolls literature. And the Essenian Jews lived in and I'll talk later about why I'm talking about Enochic literature and Essenian Jews together. That'll become apparent in subsequent lectures. But I think what we could understand is that the Enochian literature provided a Jewish mythology, and I believe for the early church, particularly for the strands of the church seen in men like John the Revelator, I believe in the early church, the Enochian literature provided what we might call Christian mythology. And that mythological component of the faith was lost when the ancient cosmological worldview collapsed or was pushed away. And so what we saw with the transition into the Middle Ages was Pharisaic Judaism substituted Essenian Judaism as the origin point for Christianity. And we've been living with that ever since, because a lot of particularly in the Protestant circles that I move in, a lot of the discussion, debate, and the preaching has to do with grace and law and what the role of it's a heavy focus on salvation, which is great, it's necessary, but you would have to wonder what's been lost when we don't have the Christian mythology that the early church had due to this cosmological revolution. That might be controversial for some. If you take issue with that, please, I'd love to hear from you and to gain your perspective. I'm not being dogmatic about any of this, and it's all just trying to arrive at the truth of things. What was gained, though, that this change into the medieval period, it replaced an embodied cosmic framework with a philosophical one, and for good or ill, this laid the foundations for secular materialist modernity. Now, all of us would have to admit we like the material, this age of material wonders that we live in, modernity. It's just been amazing. Who can't like Wi-Fi and carbonated drinks? I can't think. It's nice to live in a technological society, and all of that was made possible by this cosmological transition away from a personally governed mythic worldview into a more reasoned, rational one that ultimately led into modernity. And this has been the basis for the development of modern science and technology. The application of reason to nature that developed as a critique in response to the medieval worldview was ironically made possible by the earlier cosmological revolution from the ancient to the medieval. So that was a net gain, I guess we could say. A key takeaway that I'd like you to have from this lecture is that during the transition from the ancient to the medieval period, a new cosmological worldview was created. It was a synthesis of Greek philosophy, Roman social order, and Christian concepts. And once we can come to terms with that, it has profound implications for how we understand the Bible. In the next lecture, I'll begin to trace the development of that ancient worldview itself, and we're going to be going right back to the beginning, around about 10,000 BC. And I'll see you then.